We're going to be looking at bureaucracy, specifically like, what's the point of it, whether to look at the ideal state versus as well as some of the problems with it, the policy making and implementing of it, nature of it, how people are selected from the patronage system to civil service testing, whether it's successful or not, and then we're going to end with sort of just a general policy overview. Bureaucracy as a general rule sort of has a bad name, but there you could raise the question, do you really exist without it? So bureaucracy is what tracks you throughout the government. So your birth certificate, social security number, driver's license, death certificate, just a few of the many ways that we're tracked within the bureaucratic system and the way they again, sort of keep track of us as, from one beginning of our life until the end. So Max Weber sort of came up with the idea, or really defined, I guess, bureaucracy as sort of an ideal government structure and a way to make government act more like business was sort of his idea. So three things that I'm going to highlight from his theory is he believes in specialization. So specialization, each person sort of fulfills a specialized role. Impersonalization, so you treat each person exactly the same. So again, that's sort of the idea. If you go to the DMV, you experience this, right? You're a number, not a name. That's sort of the idea of bureaucracy under Max Weber's theory. And then divisions of labor. Again, the DMV is a great example of this. If you go to a larger DMV where there's multiple stations, right, you often have to go to 2 to 3 different stations as each person's only doing one set specific job. So you go to that one, then followed by the next one. Again, you kind of get sent back and forth between because there are these divisions of labor. Characteristics of a bureaucracy is that hierarchical structure. So again, you see this in both the public and the private sectors. So corporations often have this as well, but that hierarchical structure is sort of a characteristic of bureaucracy. Set formal rules and procedures, our standard operating procedures, are quite common. So again, they can usually be fairly complex. As I mentioned already, right, specialized in divisions of labor. Everybody's sort of broken up to their ones, very, very specific and specialized task. They maintain files and records. Again, as I mentioned in the first slide, right, most of the records of our life are maintained by some sort of bureaucracy. The other thing not necessarily on here to just try to highlight, and we'll talk a little bit more of this, is the characteristic of the employees. So you either get civil servants, so this career sort of, so those who are there for life, sort of career employees, and then you get your sort of specialized professional people who are usually very highly specialized in specific things and often appointed and at the tops of the organizations. I mentioned Max Weber sort of saw this as the ideal government structure, but it's not necessarily ideal. There are definitely some problems with the structure. One is restricted communication. So in a true bureaucracy, you only get top-down communication, so there's no way to communicate from the bottom up or even those on the same level within. So inner communication doesn't really take place. Communication in a true bureaucracy is very top-down. It's an emphasis on the workers. So he did not put a lot of time into who's being served or the services that are being provided, but only kind of focused on the workers. And focusing on the workers, you get what you see is often an over specialization, right? You get very well at one thing, which makes it hard for you to move or change into any other position within the bureaucracy, which can often get boring and lead to burnout as well. The standard operating procedures can often lead to an inability to think through a problem. And again, if you've dealt with a government agency or if you had to call in for an IT, because that's my always best example of this, right? You call into an IT, you know you're calling into a help desk, and you can tell they're reading sort of this question, right? And if your answers don't fit into their questions, they sort of don't really know where to go on and move. And the same thing can happen in government bureaucracies. With standard operating procedures, if you have a situation that's sort of outside the standard, it can often be hard to get it figured out because they're going to operate under their standard procedures and your problem, your issue doesn't fit under that. Talking about the workers again, Max Weber really saw workers as like sort of, he referred to them as cogs in a machine, right? So you just take one cog out, you replace it with another cog, and we know in the real world it doesn't work that way. Someone leaves after 20 to 25 years of working, they take a lot of knowledge and experience with them. Somebody brand new coming in isn't going to be able to just replace them, right? So people are not as replaceable as his principle or his theory suggested. And then the principle of careerism is not so much tied to Max Weber as it is to the civil service testing that has gone into play, and we'll talk a little bit more about that there. But the principle of careerism and the fact that it's really hard for a government employee or bureaucratic employee to be let go or get demoted, and that can lead to sort of mediocre work. All right, so as I mentioned with the careerism, so originally, and this would be not very well in line with Max Weber's sort of theory, but most of the early people who were appointed to or given roles within bureaucracies or state governments was done through what's known as the spoil system or patronage system. Basically, it's who you know and what have you done for me lately. Again, in Illinois, we're fairly familiar with this type of system. So you see, a spoil system, right? So people were appointed based on who they knew, how much money, a bribery, things like that. Political machines sort of decided, right? So that's who decided who was getting into these types of positions. And we mentioned Illinois, this was quite common for a very long time. So this began to change with there was, again, high level of corruption in the late 1800s, if you know your history very well, in the U.S. government. And this led to what is known as the Pendleton Act or the Civil Service Act. And that basically eliminated the patronage system and it changed it to a merit system. So the advantage of this is that you have a neutral competency, right? So you basically take exams to get into the federal or most state systems today. And so it's based off of that, it's very regimented. And the idea is that there's equity and fairness, right? It's not about who you know or what you did or who, what political party you're part of. It's just kind of that, again, again, a number, not a name sort of idea as well. So again, the U.S. system did this with the Pendleton Act in 1883. I'm going to point out that Illinois did not do this until the 1970s, so almost 100 years later. Hence, we still have, we talk to parents or grandparents and that have lived in Illinois, this was not that uncommon in their lifetime, in their early part of their lifetime, to some extent, depending on how old your parents are, and definitely probably your grandparents would have experienced this. I mean, it was not uncommon for basically the wards in Chicago, right, the 50 wards, to go to whoever gave the most money, right? You basically bought the seats. So fortunately, that did finally change, but we still have quite a legacy of it in Illinois. Merit systems, again, not all it's cracked up to be. There's rarely a perfect system. There are some disadvantages. You lose accountability, and that's what I mentioned with the careerism. Once you get in a position, it's very hard to get rid of somebody who's not performing at least a mediocre level. So you don't ever have to continue to perform at a high level. You take tests to move up. So if you take tests, you score high enough and you move up into position, you find out, hey, this isn't really for me. There's no way for you to move back down or move into another position. Or say you become a manager, you find out managing people is not for you. You want to kind of go back into another role. That becomes very difficult. So it gets very regimented. There's a lot of red tape, and it's perceived as fairly inefficient system, but we at least have neutral competency, right, and a fairness to the system. Now we'll kind of look at bureaucracy and what it does. So bureaucracy is this sort of complicated, often referred to as the fourth branch of government, even though it's not an official branch, but it's actually probably the largest branch of government at both the federal and the state levels. Bureaucracy is also complicated if we think about our separation of powers and our checks and balances, because bureaucracy or the agencies generally sit under the executive branch, which would make sense because for the most part they're policy implementing, right? They're enforcing rules and regulations passed through legislation. However, most legislation is not very detailed and doesn't give a lot of information, and there's holes, right? So often bureaucracies and agencies have to be policy making. They're writing a lot of the rules and regulations. You hear often about this at the federal level, right? That's why often when presidents can change, some of the regulations can change with the presidents because the agencies are writing them. The legislation just sort of gave them a mandate. So bureaucracy is both policy implementing, which is the executive branch, but it's also policy making, which is the legislative branch. So it definitely skews this whole idea of separation of powers because you have two powers within one branch. And we can throw in the third power as well. They do also adjudicate. If you've ever dealt with a government agency, especially at the federal level, you have to go through their adjudication or their sort of court process and appeal process before you can go to an actual court system. So if you're wronged by an agency, you have to go through their process internally for adjudication before you can take the court case to a federal or state court. And the federal and state courts have generally been pretty deferred. They often defer to the agencies and the agency's determination of terms and regulations and all of that. So bureaucracies basically have all three of the different powers granted to government within their what they are doing. There is oversight. Executive branch is the head of the agency, so they can dictate priorities, especially through budgeting. Legislative branch also has to approve those budgets, and they can hold hearings on agency actions. So there is some oversight. As I mentioned, the judiciary branch actually does not provide a whole lot of oversight unless an agency is just really, really outside the bounds of what was some sort of legal precedent. For the most part, the legislative branch does not step in too much into the bureaucratic realm. It's mostly oversight by the executive and legislative branches. So bureaucracies and agencies have quite a few problems as they're trying to deal through and work through things. And we'll talk about policy making and some of these in a little more detail. But they're dealing with a very complex tax environment, right? There's competing demands by citizens as far as what needs to be done, how it should be done. And the legislation given to them by the legislatures is usually often ambiguous and vague. So they're often have to deal with sort of determining, right, what is it exactly they're supposed to be doing. And government can get complicated, legislation can get complicated, and so there can also often be a duplication of work, right? So two different agencies working on similar things or working together, but they don't often work, they often work in silos or apart, and so it can make the work actually very difficult to work on and get done. So it leads to the question about, whether or not they're successful. So bureaucracy is probably the one branch that sort of rivals the legislative branch as far as the least popular. And oftentimes you hear about how it's not. And whether or not it's successful at something really depends on one, who you ask and what you're asking about, right? How it affects them or how it might have hurt them. There's also really just not a clear measuring stick for success for the agencies. And this is one of the things that makes it hard to gauge. It makes it hard to sort of build them up or explain to the public exactly what they're doing. And so the problem is what does effective mean? So what does an effective agency look like, right? Does it run efficiently? Well, if they're running efficiently, they may not be meeting everybody's needs. Is it that they're serving the public good? Well, they're serving the public good at a great expense to the public. Are they just doing something, right? And often that becomes the meter of what happens, right? Are they doing something? To get a little cynical for a moment, we can, and kind of question whether or not there's even a will to succeed within bureaucracies. So agencies are created to solve problems, right? That's the purpose, right? There's some sort of problem in society, and we create an agency that's designed to sort of help solve that problem. Well, what happens if they solve the problem? They're no longer needed, right? The agency goes away, there's no justification. Even if they make the problem significantly better, the way the government works and when we get to budgets, right, we're going to talk about this. Solving a problem means that you don't need your budget anymore, right? Or you can have a lot lower budget, or you don't need as many personnel. So there's really an incentive within agencies and bureaucracies to make just very slow progress, right? You have to make some progress. You have to show you're doing something. But slow progress is really to the greatest benefit. Actually, slow progress by showing you need more resources and more help and more money so that you can get a larger budget is actually going to be the best thing. And that's why you can see these. And again, you hear a lot of the conversations about budgets and bureaucracies kind of getting larger. And so this can happen. And again, sort of the cynical view, but there is that, right? If you're created to solve a problem, but you solve that problem, you now no longer have a purpose. There's an incentive there to not necessarily fully ever solve the problem. Shift here and ending on sort of public policy, which I think is important to understand for this. And this will also kind of lead us up into when we talk about the budget in a couple of weeks. So making public policy is kind of, again, this is going to tie into what we were just talking about. So it's in a government's attempt to solve a collective problem. So public policy is basically, government, there's this problem that you can't solve on your own, the private industry can't solve it. So we need the government agency that can come in and solve it. There's a lot of difficulties with that. One, not everybody agrees there's a problem, right? They don't necessarily think, and you can think of probably lots of examples of this where, it's even just hard to get started because you have a fairly significant portion of the population who just doesn't think there's a problem or doesn't think what they're happening is a problem or a big enough problem government should be involved or government's not the right ones to solve the problem. The second problem is it often takes a lot of money, and where's that money going to come from? So anytime you're taking money to solve one problem, you've got to take the money from someplace else. So again, money is very finite, so you're limited in those resources, and so you have to make some choices and decisions. And then the last one is that problems are really complex. If they were easy to fix, and when they are easy, they get done very quickly, right? So these are the problems that are very complex. There's often multiple reasons. It's not always clear what the exact cause of the problem is, and it's usually not clear the best way to fix it. And of course, there's going to be a lot of disagreements on that as well, right? Not everyone's going to agree there's even a problem, and they're definitely not going to all agree on the best way to solve that problem. Therefore, it's quite complex and very difficult. I want to focus on 3 different types of public policy you should be aware of. So redistributive policies, and these are policies that shift resources from those who have it to those who do not. So you're taking resources from, again, from one group and giving it to another. Distributive, so you're generally taking resources from everyone, but then you're only distributing them to a small group of people. So education would actually fit into this because it only applies to those with kids. And then regulatory. And these are designed to change behavior. So you can think of government regulations, environmental regulations. So regulatory policies are designed to make someone or a group of people or a group of businesses make some sort of change to their behavior. Tying this all back in together, who makes or influences policies, right? It's basically anybody we're talking about the government. So all of the levels of government, the courts, media, interest groups, the bureaucracy, which we're talking about right now, right? So all of these elements make or influence our policy. There's a couple also different ways, and I mentioned these earlier in the semester. So people who sometimes will look at this and say it's an iron triangle. It's really these three groups, legislators, bureaucrats, interest groups working together, and everyone else is sort of left out of the decision making. And if you don't know, interest groups are often the ones who write legislation because they're usually tied very closely to one topic. They know that topic better than anybody else, and so they usually are the ones who end up writing a lot of our legislation, giving it to legislatures, and then they often work with bureaucrats to help enforce it. So again, it's something they're very well known. They're the experts in that. And so it can be actually a very good relationship as long as it's not seen as the iron triangle, right? Keeping everybody else out. Those who see it more positively refer to it as an issue network, right? We're getting the best, the experts, those who are the most, know this topic the best. We're finding out from them. We're hearing from multiple different groups, and then we're making the best decisions from that. So that would be the sort of the ideal version of it. And then again, iron triangle would be more of a cynical view. Okay, so we also have some different types of policies within this. So again, social policies would be your social welfare type of policies. So these are usually both distributive and redistributive policies, again, meant to improve the lives of citizens. They're often means tested, which means that if you qualify, you get them, which means they're often referred to as entitlement programs. So these would be your social policies, social welfare type policies. Another type of policy is economic policies. And so this is a government's attempt to solve economic problems. At the state level, we're pretty much talking sort of fiscal. So the balanced budgets, whether you have deficits, surpluses, can make a difference, as well as business regulations. These are probably the 2 ways, your taxes, as you just talked about in the governmental as the governor's debate talked about, right? Property taxes, whether or not people are staying or leaving from the state, can depend on the amount of taxes, and all of that affects the economy of the state. And we're going to end on tax policy, which really will set us up for our budget discussion in 2 weeks. So there's 5 different types of taxes that states can basically choose from. Progressive taxes are generally income taxes, which means that the more money you make, right, the more you end up paying. So anything over like 40,000, you're going to pay a higher percentage than everything you make under 40,000. Regressive taxes are considered, like sales taxes are considered regressive taxes, and that's because the poor pay a higher percentage of what they make. So they're not necessarily paying more, but they're just paying a higher percentage of what they earn, right? So if you're only buying what you absolutely necessarily need, and somebody else is buying, what they need plus maybe a little bit more, but it's the sales tax on what you need is what's sort of being looked at, right? So you pay more of your income is going to sales tax. Flat tax is kind of the idea that everybody pays the same. We don't have a lot of those. Capital gains taxes might be the closest, but these are taxes on investments. So again, these can often be controversial because sometimes people invest and that is their whole income. And sometimes investment is just your retirement and other things. And so the problem with the investment taxes, right, is it affects people differently because what type of money they're investing is different. Some people, they're investing income that was already taxed by the income tax, and now it's going to be taxed again by the capital gains tax. Some people, their investments is their income, right? That's where their whole income comes from. And then in that case, they're actually paying a much lower percentage than those who are paying income taxes. And so you see a lot of controversy around that one. And then consumption taxes is one of the new ones that's sort of up and coming. Again, it kind of fits within that regulatory or changing. There's kind of another way of changing people's behavior, individuals. So as opposed to regulatory, which usually looks at businesses or sort of larger groups, consumption taxes would try to change individual behaviors. So you can see consumption taxes on things. New York did this, like right with sodas. Cigarettes have a consumption tax, alcohol. So again, you pay based on what you spend on those. Right. So that's sort of the idea of some policy and bureaucracy, and we'll be talking more about it this week.